The summer heat made everyone uncomfortable as guests gathered outside the elegant riverside manor for Sarah and Michael's wedding reception. The venue's sprawling lawn stretched toward the lake, decorated with white roses and twinkling lights that would shine beautifully once evening arrived. Guests mingled in their finest clothes, sipping champagne and taking photos near the flower arrangements. Among the well-dressed crowd stood an elderly man who seemed completely out of place. Frank Morrison, 72 years old, wore a faded military camouflage uniform that had seen better days. The fabric looked worn and the colors had dulled over time, making him stand out like a sore thumb among the designer suits and elegant dresses. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his posture remained straight despite his age, but his choice of clothing drew unwanted attention. Sarah's college friends gathered near the dessert table, whispering and pointing in Frank's direction. Jennifer, the maid of honor, rolled her eyes dramatically as she spoke to her group. "I cannot believe someone actually showed up to a wedding dressed like that. Does he think this is some kind of military event? It's so inappropriate and embarrassing." Her friend Madison nodded in agreement, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace. "Seriously, who wears camouflage to a wedding? The bride and groom spent thousands of dollars on this beautiful venue, and this old man shows up looking like he just came from hunting in the woods. Someone should have told him there was a dress code." The comments grew louder as more guests noticed Frank standing quietly by himself near the edge of the reception area. He held a small wrapped gift in his weathered hands and occasionally glanced toward the happy couple, a gentle smile crossing his face whenever he saw them laughing together. Despite the stares and whispered remarks, he maintained his dignity and continued to observe the celebration from his position. Michael's business associates also began making remarks about the unusual guest. Robert, a wealthy investor, spoke loudly enough for others to hear his criticism. "I wonder where they found this character. Veterans always think they can wear their old uniforms everywhere they go. This is supposed to be a classy affair, not some backyard barbecue where anything goes." His colleague James laughed and added his own commentary. "Maybe someone should explain to him that the war ended a long time ago. Normal people wear suits to weddings, not their old military costumes. It's really quite embarrassing for everyone involved." The bride's mother, Patricia, noticed the growing commotion and felt increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. She had worked for months planning every detail of this reception to ensure everything would be perfect for her daughter's special day. The thought of having photos ruined by someone in inappropriate attire made her anxious, and she began considering whether she should approach the elderly man and suggest he leave early. Meanwhile, Frank remained unaware of the full extent of the negative attention he was receiving. He had carefully chosen to wear his dress uniform because it represented the most important chapter of his life, and he wanted to honor the young couple by wearing something that held deep personal significance. The uniform might have looked old and faded to others, but to him, it represented decades of service, sacrifice, and pride in defending his country. As the cocktail hour continued, more guests began to notice the contrast between Frank's appearance and the formal atmosphere of the event. Some took discreet photos with their phones, planning to share them later as examples of wedding fashion disasters. Others simply avoided the area where he stood, not wanting to be associated with someone who seemed so out of place. The elderly veteran noticed some of the stares but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on the joy he felt watching the newlyweds celebrate their union. He remembered his own wedding day many decades ago, and how grateful he felt to be invited to witness this young couple beginning their journey together. Little did anyone know that Frank's presence at this wedding was far more significant than any of them could have imagined, and their judgments about his appearance would soon be proven completely wrong. The situation became more uncomfortable as dinner service began, and guests moved toward their assigned tables. Frank found his seat at table 12, positioned toward the back of the reception area where he wouldn't be prominently visible in wedding photos. The other guests at his table included some of Michael's distant relatives, who seemed equally puzzled by his presence and choice of attire. Margaret, Michael's elderly aunt, leaned toward her husband and spoke in what she thought was a whisper. "Harold, look at that man's outfit. I've never seen anything so inappropriate at a wedding in my entire life. Those camouflage clothes look like they belong in a military surplus store, not at an elegant reception like this one." Harold adjusted his glasses and studied Frank more carefully before responding. "You're absolutely right, dear. Back in our day, people understood how to dress properly for special occasions. veterans or not. There's simply no excuse for showing up to a wedding looking like you're ready for combat duty. The conversation at the table became increasingly awkward as other guests joined in the criticism. Frank tried to focus on his meal and the beautiful surroundings, but he couldn't help overhearing the negative comments being made about his appearance. He began to question whether he had made the right decision in attending the wedding, especially since his presence seemed to be causing such distraction from the celebration. At the head table, Sarah finally noticed the commotion surrounding the elderly man in camouflage and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She had been so focused on enjoying her wedding day that she hadn't paid attention to what her guests were wearing. But now she realized that everyone was talking about this one particular individual who seemed completely out of place. "Michael," she whispered to her new husband, nodding discreetly in Frank's direction. "Do you see that man over there in the military outfit? Everyone's staring at him and making comments about how inappropriate his clothes are. I'm starting to feel really uncomfortable about the whole situation." Michael followed his wife's gaze and spotted Frank sitting quietly at his table, seemingly unaware of the negative attention he was receiving. A puzzled expression crossed Michael's face as he tried to remember who this man was and why he would have been invited to their wedding. The guest list had been carefully planned, and he couldn't recall adding anyone who might show up in military attire. "I honestly don't remember inviting him," Michael admitted to his bride. "Maybe he's someone from your side of the family that I haven't met yet. Or possibly one of my father's old friends who I don't recognize. I'm really not sure who he is or why he's here, Amo." Bride's confusion grew as she realized that neither she nor her husband could identify this mysterious guest who had become the center of so much unwanted attention. She began to worry that perhaps he had somehow attended the wrong wedding, or that there had been some kind of mistake with the invitations. Meanwhile, the photographer moved through the reception, taking candid shots of the celebration, but he deliberately avoided including Frank in any of the photos. The contrast between the elderly man's faded camouflage uniform and the elegant formal wear of the other guests would have created an jarring visual element that might have detracted from the overall aesthetic of the wedding album. As the evening progressed, more guests became aware of Frank's presence and began speculating about his identity and his reason for wearing military clothing to such a formal event. Some wondered if he might be suffering from dementia and had simply forgotten how to dress appropriately for the occasion. Others suggested that he might be making some kind of political statement or trying to draw attention to himself. The whispered conversations and sideways glances continued throughout the dinner service, creating an undercurrent of tension that began to affect the overall atmosphere of the celebration. Frank, despite his best efforts to remain positive and focus on the joy of the occasion, could sense that his presence was causing problems for the happy couple and their guests. He began to consider the possibility of leaving early to avoid further disruption, but something kept him in his seat. Perhaps it was his sense of duty, or maybe it was the mysterious connection he felt to this particular wedding that he couldn't quite explain. Whatever the reason, Frank decided to stay and endure the uncomfortable stares and whispered criticisms, unaware that his patience would soon be rewarded in the most unexpected way. The evening entertainment began with the traditional first dance as Sarah and Michael moved gracefully across the wooden dance floor that had been installed on the lawn for the occasion. The string quartet played a romantic melody, while guests watched from their tables, many taking photos and videos of the magical moment. However, the pleasant atmosphere was still overshadowed by the ongoing whispers and glances directed toward Frank Jennifer. The maid of honor decided she had endured enough of what she considered to be a disruption to her best friend's perfect wedding day. She stood up from the head table and walked purposefully toward Frank's table, her designer heels clicking against the temporary flooring. Her intention was to politely but firmly suggest that he might be more comfortable leaving the reception early. "Excuse me, sir," Jennifer said as she approached Frank's table, her voice carrying a tone of barely concealed irritation. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem a bit overdressed for the occasion. This is actually a formal wedding reception, and most of our guests chose to wear appropriate attire for such an elegant event." Frank looked up at the young woman with kind eyes, his weathered face showing no signs of anger or defensiveness despite the obvious criticism in her words. He had faced much worse situations during his military service and understood that not everyone would appreciate or understand his choice to wear his dress uniform to such an occasion. Apologize if my appearance has caused any concern, Frank replied in a calm, respectful voice. I chose to wear my dress uniform because it represents the most important part of my life, and I wanted to honor the young couple by wearing something that holds deep personal significance to me. Jennifer was taken aback by his polite response, having expected either anger or embarrassment from the elderly man. However, she remained determined to resolve what she saw as an inappropriate situation that was detracting from her friend's special day. Well, I appreciate your sentiment, she continued, but surely you must realize that camouflage clothing isn't really suitable for a wedding reception. Perhaps you might consider leaving a bit early so that the bride and groom can enjoy the rest of their evening without any distractions. Other guests at nearby tables began to turn their attention toward the conversation, sensing that some kind of confrontation was developing. The music continued to play, but the tension in that section of the reception area was becoming increasingly noticeable to anyone paying attention. Frank considered Jennifer's suggestion carefully, understanding that his presence was clearly causing discomfort for some of the wedding guests. He had no desire to create problems for the happy couple or to detract from their celebration in any way. However, something deep inside him insisted that he should remain at the reception, though he couldn't quite explain why he felt so strongly about staying. I understand your concerns, Frank said quietly, and I certainly don't want to cause any problems for the bride and groom. However, I believe there may be reasons for my presence here that haven't become clear yet. Would it be possible for me to speak with Michael directly about this situation? The request caught Jennifer off guard, as she hadn't expected the elderly man to ask for a personal conversation with the groom. She glanced back toward the head table where Michael was now talking with some of his groomsmen, seemingly unaware of the developing situation at the back of the reception area. I'm not sure that's really necessary, Jennifer replied, her frustration beginning to show more clearly. Michael is obviously busy celebrating his wedding day, and I don't think he needs to be bothered with this kind of situation. I'm sure you're a nice person, but your outfit is really quite inappropriate for this occasion. Frank nodded understandingly, but remained firm in his position. I respect your concern for your friend's happiness, but I believe this conversation would be better resolved by speaking directly with the groom. There are things about my presence here that might not be immediately obvious to everyone. The cryptic nature of Frank's responses only increased Jennifer's confusion and frustration. She couldn't understand why this elderly stranger was being so insistent about staying at a wedding where he clearly didn't belong, and his mysterious comments about hidden reasons for his presence only made the situation more puzzling. As their conversation continued, other guests began to take notice of what appeared to be a developing confrontation. Some of Michael's college friends moved closer to hear what was being said, while others pulled out their phones to discreetly record what they expected might become an entertaining wedding drama to share on social media later. The growing commotion finally caught Michael's attention as he noticed a small crowd gathering near table 12. Concerned that there might be some kind of problem developing at his wedding reception, he excused himself from the groomsmen and walked over to investigate the situation. Sarah followed close behind, worried that whatever was happening might further disrupt their celebration. Is everything all right over here? Michael asked as he approached the group that had formed around Frank's table. He could see Jennifer standing with her arms crossed, looking frustrated, while the elderly man in camouflage remained seated calmly, seemingly unbothered by all the attention he was receiving. Jennifer immediately began explaining the situation to the groom, her voice carrying a tone of exasperation. Michael, I've been trying to explain to this gentleman that his outfit isn't really appropriate for your wedding reception. He's been causing quite a distraction all evening, and several guests have commented about how uncomfortable they feel with his presence here. Michael looked down at Frank, taking in the details of the worn military uniform and the elderly man's dignified bearing. Despite the obvious criticism he was facing, something about Frank's appearance seemed familiar, though Michael couldn't quite place where he might have seen him before. Sir, I'm Michael, the groom, he said, extending his hand toward Frank. I have to admit that I'm a bit confused about the situation here. Could you help me understand who you are and how you came to be invited to our wedding? Frank stood up slowly, his military training evident in his straight posture and respectful demeanor as he shook Michael's hand firmly. The crowd of onlookers grew larger as more guests noticed that the bride and groom were now personally involved in whatever drama was unfolding. My name is Frank Morrison, And I served in the United States Army for 32 years before retiring with the rank of colonel, Frank said clearly, his voice carrying the authority and precision that came from decades of military leadership. I chose to wear my dress uniform today because this is one of the most important days of my life. And I wanted to honor you and your bride by wearing something that represents my greatest source of pride. The mention of his military rank caused some murmurs among the gathered guests, as they hadn't expected the elderly man to have achieved such a high position during his service. However, Jennifer remained skeptical about his explanations and unconvinced that his military background justified his choice of attire. That's very nice, Colonel Morrison, Michael said respectfully, but I'm still confused about how you came to be invited to our wedding. I don't recall adding your name to our guest list, and neither Sarah nor I can remember meeting you before today. Frank smiled gently at the young groom, understanding his confusion, but knowing that the full explanation would soon become clear to everyone present. The truth is, Michael, that you didn't invite me directly. However, someone very important to you specifically requested that I attend this celebration, and they asked me to wait until the appropriate moment to reveal why I'm here. This cryptic response only deepened the mystery surrounding Frank's presence and caused even more speculation among the wedding guests. Sarah moved closer to her husband, feeling increasingly uncomfortable about the strange situation that was developing at what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. I'm sorry, but I really don't understand what you're talking about, Michael said, his confusion evident in his voice. Who could have asked you to attend our wedding without telling us about it? And why would they want to keep it a secret until now? Frank glanced at his watch and then looked up toward the darkening sky as if he was waiting for something specific to happen. I'm afraid I can't reveal those details just yet, but I promise you that everything will become clear very soon. In fact, I believe the explanation you're looking for should be arriving within the next few minutes. The mysterious nature of Frank's responses was beginning to frustrate not only Jennifer and the other critics, but also Michael himself, who was starting to wonder if the elderly man might be suffering from some kind of mental confusion. The idea that someone would attend his wedding based on secret instructions from an unknown person seemed increasingly unlikely and concerning. Sir, with all due respect, I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here, Michael said carefully. Perhaps you've confused our wedding with another event, or maybe someone played a practical joke on you by telling you to come here. Either way, I think it might be best if we try to sort this out away from our other guests. Before Frank could respond to Michael's suggestion, a distant sound began to emerge from the evening sky that caused him to look up with a knowing smile. At first, it was barely audible over the music and conversation, but it gradually grew louder and more distinct. The rhythmic whipping sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the air became unmistakable, causing several guests to pause their conversations and look around in confusion. What is that noise? Sarah asked, moving closer to Michael as the sound continued to grow louder and more intense. The string quartet stopped playing as even they became distracted by the approaching aircraft, and guests began looking up at the sky, trying to locate the source of the sound. Frank remained calm and composed, checking his watch once more before addressing the increasingly puzzled crowd around him. That would be the explanation I promised you was coming. I believe you're about to understand exactly why I was asked to attend your wedding today, and why my presence here is far more significant than any of you realized. The helicopter sound grew dramatically louder as a massive military Black Hawk aircraft appeared over the tree line surrounding the wedding venue. The powerful rotors created strong winds that began blowing the tablecloths and flower arrangements, causing guests to hold onto their hats and cover their drinks as debris swirled around the reception area. Panic began to spread among the wedding guests as the enormous helicopter circled the venue once before beginning its descent toward the open lawn area adjacent to the reception. Many people had never seen a military aircraft up close, and the sight of the imposing Black Hawk preparing to land at their elegant wedding celebration was both thrilling and terrifying. Everyone, please move away from the landing area, Frank called out in his commanding military voice, instantly taking charge of the situation as his years of training kicked in. Stay calm and move toward the building. Military personnel are trained for this type of operation. Michael and Sarah stood frozen in amazement as they watched the Black Hawk touch down on their wedding venue's lawn with precision and skill. The powerful downdraft from the rotors continued to create chaos among the decorations and table settings, But the guests were too mesmerized by the incredible sight to worry about the mess being created. As the helicopter's engines began to wind down, the side door opened and several figures in military dress uniforms began to emerge. The first person to step out was a tall, distinguished man wearing the uniform of a United States Army general. His chest decorated with numerous ribbons and medals that indicated a long and distinguished career. Frank walked toward the aircraft with confident steps, his worn camouflage uniform suddenly seeming much more appropriate, given the dramatic turn of events. The criticism and mockery he had endured throughout the evening now seemed petty and foolish as the reality of his importance became undeniably clear to everyone present. The general approached Frank with obvious respect and familiarity, saluting him crisply before extending his hand in greeting. "Colonel Morrison, it's an honor to see you again, sir. I hope we haven't disrupted the celebration too much with our arrival." "Not at all, General Patterson," Frank replied, returning the salute with military precision despite his civilian surroundings. "In fact, I think our timing is perfect. There are some people here who have been very curious about my presence at this wedding, and I believe you're about to provide them with all the answers they've been seeking." The wedding guests watched in stunned silence as more military personnel emerged from the Black Hawk, including several officers in dress uniforms and what appeared to be a small honor guard, carrying folded American flags. The contrast between the elegant wedding reception and the dramatic military arrival created a surreal scene that none of the guests would ever forget. Jennifer, who had been so critical of Frank's appearance just minutes earlier, now stood with her mouth open in shock as she began to realize that the elderly man she had tried to embarrass and remove from the wedding was clearly someone of great importance in the military community. The faded camouflage uniform that had seemed so inappropriate now appeared to be the dress of a true hero. Sarah clutched Michael's arm tightly as they watched the incredible scene unfolding on their wedding day. "Michael, who is this man?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe and confusion. "What is happening at our wedding?" General Patterson approached Michael and Sarah with the dignity and bearing that came from decades of military leadership. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone at the reception, and the wedding guests instinctively formed a respectful semicircle around the small group near the helicopter. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," the general said formally, "allow me to introduce myself. I am General Robert Patterson, United States Army. I apologize for the dramatic interruption of your wedding celebration, but I'm here today to fulfill a very special promise that was made to Colonel Frank Morrison many years ago." Michael found his voice, despite his amazement at the surreal situation unfolding at his wedding. "General, I'm honored to meet you, but I have to admit that I'm completely confused about what's happening here. I don't understand the connection between Colonel Morrison and our wedding." The general smiled warmly and gestured toward Frank, who stood quietly nearby with tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Colonel Morrison saved my life during our deployment in Afghanistan 15 years ago. When enemy forces overran our position, he single-handedly held them off while coordinating the evacuation of our entire unit, including myself." The wedding guests listened in absolute silence as General Patterson continued his explanation, their earlier criticism of Frank's appearance now seeming shameful and embarrassing in light of his heroic background. "During that firefight, Colonel Morrison was severely wounded while protecting the rest of us," the general continued. "As we waited for medical evacuation, he told me about his son who was serving in a different unit. He was so proud of that young man and talked constantly about how much he looked forward to seeing him get married someday." Sarah gasped audibly as she began to understand where this story was leading, and Michael's face went pale as pieces of the puzzle started falling into place in his mind. Colonel Morrison's son was Sergeant David Morrison, who served with distinction in the same theater where his father had been wounded, General Patterson said solemnly. "Unfortunately, David was killed in action just 3 months before he was scheduled to return home and marry his fiancée." The emotional weight of the revelation hit Michael like a physical blow as he realized the connection that had brought Frank to his wedding. Memories flooded back of conversations with his late father about his military service and the friends he had made during his deployment overseas. "Your father, Sergeant Michael Thompson, served alongside David Morrison," the general explained gently. "Before David died, he made your father promise that if anything happened to him, someone would make sure that Frank knew about any important family events, especially weddings. Your father kept that promise until his own death 2 years ago. Tears were now flowing freely down Michael's face as he understood the incredible sacrifice and love that had brought Frank to his wedding day. The elderly colonel had not only lost his son in service to their country, but had also honored his fallen comrade by attending the wedding of his friend's son. When we learned about your wedding, we knew we had to honor both David's memory and your father's promise, General Patterson continued. Colonel Morrison specifically requested to attend your celebration, and he wanted to present you with something that belonged to your father. Frank stepped forward and reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small, carefully wrapped package. His hands trembled slightly with emotion as he offered it to Michael. Your father asked me to give this to you on your wedding day. He said it would help you understand how proud he was of the man you became. Michael accepted the package with shaking hands, carefully unwrapping it to reveal his father's military dog tags along with a handwritten letter, sealed in a protective plastic covering. The sight of his father's familiar handwriting on the envelope broke down the last of his emotional barriers. He wrote that letter specifically for your wedding day, Frank explained quietly. He wanted you to know that even though he wouldn't be there to see you get married, his love and pride would always be with you, through the brotherhood he shared with my son and with me. The entire wedding reception had fallen into respectful silence as guests witnessed this powerful moment of connection between military families who had sacrificed so much for their country. Many people were wiping away tears as they realized how wrong they had been to judge Frank based on his appearance. Sarah moved to stand beside her husband, placing her hand on his shoulder as he struggled to compose himself enough to respond to this incredible gift. The faded camouflage uniform that had seemed so out of place now appeared to be exactly what should be worn to honor such an important moment in their lives. Michael looked up from his father's letter with tears streaming down his face, his voice barely steady enough to speak as the full impact of Frank's presence hit him. Colonel Morrison, I had no idea. My father talked about his military service, but he never mentioned the specific details of the friendships he made or the promises he kept. Frank stepped closer to the young groom, his own emotions clearly visible despite his military composure. Your father was one of the finest men I ever had the honor to serve alongside. He saved my life during that deployment, just as I saved others. We looked out for each other because that's what brothers in arms do. General Patterson gestured toward the honor guard, who stepped forward carrying a folded American flag and a small wooden case. Colonel Morrison also wanted to present you with this flag, which flew over the base where your father and David served together. It's a symbol of the sacrifice they both made and the bond they shared. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the wedding guests had ever witnessed. Frank presented the flag to Michael with the same dignity and precision that would be shown at a military funeral, while the honor guard stood at attention in tribute to the fallen soldiers being remembered. This flag represents not just the country your father served, but the brotherhood that extends beyond death, Frank said formally. David made your father promise to ensure that military families stay connected, and your father made me promise to be here for your most important moments. Today we honor both of those promises. Sarah watched her husband accept these incredible gifts with a mixture of pride and overwhelming emotion. She finally understood why Frank had insisted on wearing his military uniform, and why he had been so mysterious about his reasons for attending their wedding. His presence wasn't inappropriate at all. It was absolutely essential. Jennifer approached Frank with obvious shame and regret, her earlier criticism now seeming cruel and ignorant. Colonel Morrison, I owe you a sincere apology. I had no idea who you were or why you were here. I'm deeply sorry for the way I treated you and for trying to make you leave our celebration. Frank accepted her apology with grace, understanding that her actions had come from ignorance rather than malice. No apology is necessary, young lady. You were trying to protect your friend's special day, and that shows loyalty and love. Now you understand that sometimes the most important guests are the ones who might not look like they belong. Other wedding guests began approaching Frank throughout the evening, eager to thank him for his service and to apologize for their earlier judgments about his appearance. The elderly colonel became the center of positive attention as people shared their own family military stories and expressed their gratitude for his sacrifice. The reception continued with a completely different atmosphere as Frank's story spread among the guests. The helicopter remained parked on the lawn as a powerful reminder of the dramatic revelation that had transformed everyone's understanding of what they had witnessed. Michael, spent much of the evening talking with Frank, learning stories about his father's military service that he had never heard before. The connection between their families created a bond that would last for the rest of their lives, ensuring that the promises made by fallen soldiers would continue to be honored. As the evening wound down, General Patterson and his team prepared to depart, but not before Frank made one final presentation to the newlyweds. He removed his own military medal from his uniform, one that he had earned for his heroic actions in Afghanistan, and pinned it to Michael's tuxedo jacket. "This medal represents the courage and sacrifice that your father showed every day he served," Frank explained. "I want you to have it as a reminder that the values he fought for, honor, duty, and loyalty, should guide you in your marriage and in your life." The Black Hawk lifted off into the night sky as Frank waved goodbye to his military brothers, but he remained at the reception as an honored guest, rather than the unwelcome intruder that some had initially perceived him to be. His faded camouflage uniform had become a symbol of heroism, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between military families. The wedding guests left that evening with a completely different understanding of what they had witnessed, and many would later say it was the most meaningful celebration they had ever attended. Frank's presence had transformed what could have been just another elegant wedding into a powerful tribute to military service and the promises that bind us together across generations.